There's a moment in every debate when you realize you're not just exchanging ideas. You're being dissected. The person across from you isn't listening to understand. They're listening to destroy. And while you're still trying to be reasonable, trying to be fair, trying to win through logic and evidence, they've already moved 3 steps ahead. They've identified your emotional triggers, mapped your argumentative patterns, and positioned themselves not just to counter your points, but to make you look foolish in the process. Most people enter debates like they're entering a classroom discussion. They bring facts, they bring passion, they bring the naive belief that the best argument wins. But Niccolò Machiavelli would have laughed at that approach because he understood something that modern debaters refuse to accept. Debates aren't won by those who are right. They're won by those who control the frame. And the frame isn't about facts. It's about perception, psychology, and the subtle art of making your opponent defeat themselves. Here's what separates the average debater from the one who never loses. The average debater reacts. They respond to accusations. They defend their positions. They try to prove their points with more evidence, more passion, more volume. But the Machiavellian debater operates from a completely different playbook. They don't react. They redirect. They don't defend. They reframe. They don't prove. They position. And by the time their opponent realizes what's happening, the debate is already over. Because here's the brutal truth that no debate coach will teach you. People don't change their minds based on logic. They change their minds based on how arguments make them feel about themselves. And if you can master the psychology of making your opponent feel uncertain, defensive, or exposed, you don't need to win the argument. You need to make them lose themselves. This isn't about being cruel. It's about understanding that in any high-stakes debate, whether it's in a boardroom, a courtroom, or a family dinner, there are invisible rules at play. Rules that determine not just who speaks, but who gets heard. Not just who argues, but who gets believed. Not just who's right, but who walks away with their reputation intact. Machiavelli didn't write about debates specifically, but he understood power dynamics better than anyone who came before or after him. He knew that influence flows not to the most moral, but to the most strategic. Not to the loudest, but to the most controlled. Not to the one with the best facts, but to the one who best understands human nature. And human nature in the heat of debate is predictable, emotional, and exploitable. So when someone challenges you, when they question your competence, your character, or your position, your first instinct is to fight back, to prove them wrong, to marshal your evidence, and deliver a devastating counter-argument. But that first instinct is exactly what they're counting on. Because the moment you start defending, you've already accepted their frame. You've agreed to play by their rules. And in their frame, with their rules, you're fighting an uphill battle you didn't even know you'd entered. The Machiavellian approach is different. It's colder, more calculated. When someone attacks your position, you don't defend the position. You question the attack. When they challenge your facts, you don't provide more facts. You examine their motives. When they raise their voice, you lower yours. When they speed up, you slow down. When they push, you don't push back. You step aside and let their momentum carry them past you. This is psychological warfare disguised as civil discourse, and it works because most people are emotionally invested in being right. They need to win. They need to be heard. They need validation. But the moment someone needs something from the debate, they've given their opponent leverage. Because need creates desperation, and desperation creates mistakes. Watch any political debate, any corporate negotiation, any courtroom cross-examination. The person who wins isn't usually the one with the better case. It's the one who remains composed while their opponent unravels. The one who asks the questions that make others squirm. The one who can make a strong argument look weak simply by raising an eyebrow at the right moment. But here's where it gets deeper. This isn't just about staying calm under pressure. Any meditation app can teach you that. This is about understanding the architecture of persuasion, how arguments are built, how they can be dismantled, and how you can lead someone to dismantle their own position without them realizing what's happening. Every argument has a foundation. Remove that foundation, and the entire structure collapses. But you don't attack the foundation directly. That creates resistance. Instead, you make them question whether the foundation was ever solid to begin with. You plant seeds of doubt that grow into forests of uncertainty. And uncertainty in a debate is death. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous opponents aren't the ones who attack you directly. They're the ones who make you attack yourself. The ones who can trigger your insecurities, expose your blind spots, and make you defend positions you're not even sure you believe in. And once you're defending instead of advancing, once you're explaining instead of exploring, once you're reacting instead of responding, you've lost control of the narrative. The narrative is everything. It's not what happened. It's how what happened gets remembered. It's not who was right. It's who appeared to be right. It's not about truth. It's about the version of truth that feels most compelling to the audience watching the exchange. And there's always an audience. Even in private conversations, even in one-on-one disputes, there's an invisible jury deciding who won, who lost, and who they'd rather align themselves with. That jury might be future colleagues who hear about the exchange. It might be family members who witness the dynamic. It might be your own subconscious, keeping score of moments when you felt powerful and moments when you felt diminished. This is why most people lose debates they should have won. They focus on being right instead of being effective. They optimize for accuracy instead of influence. They play to win the argument, while their opponent plays to win the relationship, the reputation, the long-term positioning that matters more than any single exchange of words. The Machiavellian debater thinks in systems, not statements. They're not just responding to what's being said. They're managing what's being felt, what's being assumed, and what's being concluded by everyone who witnesses the interaction. They understand that every debate is really three conversations happening simultaneously: the surface conversation about the topic at hand, the meta conversation about who has the right to speak with authority, and the subconscious conversation about who represents strength and who represents weakness. Most people only engage with the surface conversation. They argue about facts, statistics, precedents, and logical conclusions. But while they're focused on the content, their opponent is working on the context, shifting the framework, changing the criteria by which success gets measured, making the debate about something other than what it appears to be about. This is where the real power lies, not in having better arguments, but in determining what the argument is actually about, not in providing better evidence, but in deciding what counts as evidence, not in being more persuasive, but in making your opponent less credible without them realizing how it happened. But here's the thing that separates this approach from simple manipulation or cheap rhetorical tricks. The Machiavellian method isn't about deception. It's about clarity, seeing the debate for what it really is instead of what it pretends to be, understanding that influence flows through channels that have nothing to do with logic and everything to do with psychology. Human beings are not rational creatures who occasionally act emotionally. We're emotional creatures who occasionally think rationally. And in high-pressure situations like debates, that ratio skews even further toward emotion, fear, pride, anger, insecurity, the need to be seen as competent, the terror of being exposed as ignorant. These are the real forces driving most arguments. The person who acknowledges these forces and learns to work with them instead of against them gains an almost unfair advantage, because while their opponent is trying to convince them with reason, they're working on a level where reason is just one tool among many. This is where most debaters make their fatal error. They think the goal is to prove their point, but Machiavelli would tell you the real goal is to make your opponent prove yours for you. Because when someone argues themselves into your position, They don't feel defeated. They feel enlightened, and enlightened people don't seek revenge. They seek more conversations. Here's how it works. Instead of presenting your conclusion and defending it, you present their conclusion and examine it. You don't say their idea is wrong. You say their idea is interesting. Then ask questions that make them question it themselves. Questions that sound curious, not confrontational. Questions that make them think they're helping you understand, when really you're helping them discover the flaws in their own logic. That's a fascinating perspective. Help me understand how that would work in practice. Suddenly, they're not defending against your attack. They're explaining their position to someone who seems genuinely interested. And the more they explain, the more they expose the weak points you can later exploit. Not with aggression, but with more questions. I'm trying to follow your reasoning here. If that's true, then wouldn't that also mean? Now you're not arguing. You're exploring. You're not their opponent. You're their collaborator in the search for truth. Except you're leading that search toward the conclusion you wanted all along. This is psychological judo. You use their momentum against them. Their confidence becomes overconfidence. Their certainty becomes rigidity. Their passion becomes defensiveness. And you never have to attack directly because they're doing all the work for you. But here's where it gets even more sophisticated. The master level isn't just about redirecting their arguments. It's about redirecting their identity. Because people don't just defend positions. They defend their sense of self, their intelligence, their competence, their moral authority. And if you can make them question that deeper foundation, their arguments crumble automatically. You don't do this with insults. Insults create resistance and make you look petty. You do it with implications, with subtle suggestions that maybe they haven't thought this through as carefully as someone of their intelligence usually would. Maybe they're operating with incomplete information. Maybe they're letting emotion cloud their normally sharp judgment. I know you're usually more careful about these things, so I'm surprised to hear you say that without considering the obvious counterexample. What just happened? You complimented their intelligence while questioning their current reasoning. You made them want to prove they are as careful as you said they usually are. And proving that means reconsidering the position you want them to reconsider. The beauty is, they can't get angry without confirming that emotion is indeed clouding their judgment. They can't dismiss you without appearing closed-minded. They can't attack you without seeming defensive. You've created a psychological cage where every escape route leads them closer to your position. This is why Machiavelli emphasized the importance of appearing virtuous while being strategic. In debates, you must appear curious while being calculating, collaborative while being competitive, humble while being manipulative. Because the moment people sense you're playing a game, they stop playing along. The illusion must be perfect. You're not trying to win. You're trying to understand. You're not pushing your agenda. You're following the evidence wherever it leads. You're not attacking their character. You're simply noticing inconsistencies that someone as thoughtful as them would surely want to address. And here's where most people fail even when they understand these principles. They get impatient. They want the victory now in this conversation, with this exchange. But Machiavelli thought in longer time horizons. He understood that sometimes the best victory is the one that comes weeks later, when your opponent realizes you were right all along and starts defending your position to others. The seeds you plant in debate don't always bloom immediately. Sometimes they lie dormant until the right conditions present themselves, until your opponent encounters evidence that confirms what you suggested, until they have a conversation with someone else that makes them remember your questions, until they're alone with their thoughts and realize that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. This delayed gratification approach serves multiple purposes. It makes you look less manipulative in the moment. It makes your opponent feel like they came to the conclusion independently. And it builds your reputation as someone who plants ideas that turn out to be prescient, rather than someone who wins arguments through force. But there's another layer to master: the metagame. This is where you're not just managing the current debate, but positioning yourself for all future debates with this person and anyone who witnesses this exchange. You're building a brand as someone who asks the right questions, who sees patterns others miss, who remains calm under pressure, who makes others think more deeply. This reputation becomes a weapon more powerful than any single argument. Because when you walk into future debates, people already expect you to be formidable. They prepare differently. They speak more carefully. They second-guess themselves before they even begin. And that psychological advantage is worth more than perfect facts or flawless logic. The final element that separates amateur manipulators from Machiavellian masters is emotional intelligence. Not just understanding your own emotions, but reading and managing the emotions of everyone involved. Knowing when someone is feeling cornered and needs an escape route. Recognizing when someone is about to shut down and requires validation. Sensing when the audience is losing interest and needs a shift in energy. Because debates aren't just intellectual exercises, they're emotional experiences. And the person who can make others feel heard, respected, and intelligent, even while being systematically dismantled, will earn loyalty that lasts long after the specific argument is forgotten. This is the covert method Machiavelli would have used if he lived in our age of endless debates. Not louder arguments, but better questions. Not stronger positions, but more flexible frameworks. Not more aggression, but more strategic empathy. The kind of approach that wins not just debates, but minds. Not just arguments, but influence. Not just battles, but wars. When you master this level of debate, something profound shifts. You stop needing to win because you've transcended the game entirely. People begin seeking your opinion, not because you're the loudest voice in the room, but because you're the one who asks questions that change how others think about the question itself. This is where most people plateau. They learn the techniques, they practice the redirections, they master the psychological positioning, but they never evolve beyond seeing debate as combat. They're still fighting, just with more sophisticated weapons. The true Machiavellian transcends even this, because here's what separates the tactical debater from the strategic one. The tactical debater wins individual arguments. The strategic debater shapes how arguments happen. They don't just control single conversations. They influence the entire culture of discourse around them. Watch how this works in practice. When you consistently refuse to be baited into emotional reactions, others start moderating their tone around you. When you repeatedly ask questions that expose shallow thinking, people begin preparing more thoroughly before challenging you. When you demonstrate that you can dismantle arguments without destroying relationships, you become someone others want on their side rather than against them. This cultural shift is invisible but powerful. Suddenly, you're not just participating in debates. You're setting the standard for how debates should be conducted. Your approach becomes the model others unconsciously adopt. Your questions become the template others use to examine their own positions. But there's a deeper transformation happening. As you practice these methods, you begin to see through the theater of most human conflict. You recognize the patterns, the predictable emotional triggers, the desperate need for validation disguised as intellectual discourse. And with that recognition comes a strange kind of freedom. You realize that most arguments people think are important actually aren't. Most positions people defend passionately are barely thought through. Most conflicts that consume enormous energy are really about ego, not substance. And when you see this clearly, you can choose your battles with surgical precision. This is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. The person who understands the game can choose not to play it. They can rise above the noise while others exhaust themselves in pointless combat. They can influence outcomes without getting their hands dirty. They can win wars without firing shots. The covert method isn't ultimately about defeating opponents. It's about making opposition irrelevant. When you can shape how people think about thinking, when you can influence the questions they ask themselves, when you can make them grateful for the clarity you've provided, you've moved beyond debate entirely. You've become something more dangerous than someone who wins arguments. You've become someone who makes others want to think like you do. And that influence, once established, becomes almost impossible to dislodge. Because at that point, you're not just changing minds in individual conversations, you're changing how minds work. You're not just winning debates, you're making debates unnecessary by helping others see what you see, question what you question, value what you value. This is why Machiavelli's insights remain relevant centuries after he wrote them. He understood that true power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It simply is. And when you embody these principles in how you engage with others, you don't need to tell people you're formidable. They feel it. They feel it in the way you listen without reacting, in the way you question without attacking, in the way you remain curious when others become defensive, in the way you stay composed when chaos erupts around you. That feeling, that sense that you operate by different rules, that you see things they don't, that you possess some insight they lack, becomes your greatest asset, not because you're trying to intimidate, but because you've developed genuine capability. The methods work because they're based on accurate observations about human nature. And once you've internalized these patterns, once they become natural rather than calculated, you discover something unexpected. You start having better conversations, not because you're manipulating them to go your way, but because you're creating space for real thinking to happen. The questions you ask actually help people. The frame you provide actually clarifies issues. The patience you demonstrate actually allows truth to emerge. You've become genuinely more valuable to be around, not just more difficult to defeat. This is the final evolution. From someone who wins debates to someone who makes debates better. From someone who controls conversations to someone who elevates them. From someone who defeats opponents to someone who creates allies. Because in the end, the most Machiavellian move of all is making others grateful that you've shown them how to think more clearly. And when they're grateful, they're not just convinced, they're converted. Not just for this argument, but for all the arguments to come. That's how you win not just any debate, but every debate that matters. Not through force, but through influence. Not through volume, but through value. Not by being right, but by helping others discover what right actually means. The covert method isn't about hiding your strength. It's about strength so refined, so natural, so beneficial to everyone involved, that others don't experience it as force at all. They experience it as wisdom. And wisdom, once recognized, doesn't need to argue for itself. It simply transforms everything it touches.